Welcome to another CPD seminar for structural engineers. This time we're going to do something slightly different. But before we get started, a reminder of the channel. It's the Daddy Pig 6354. You search that or search for some of the titles, it should come up now. There are now 3 playlists, one from my Deep Thinkers, one from the structural engineers, MathCAD for structural engineers, and of course the CPD webinars. So see the full playlist. And if I look at the analytics for the YouTube channel, I can still see that 80% of my viewers are still not subscribed. So please subscribe to the channel, share the show with your friends, and leave a like or a comment in the description. So this is going to be a little different from the usual. I'm going to talk about myself again, and we're going to talk about how we go from CEng, that's Chartered Engineer, to CPEng, which is Chartered Professional Engineer. So that's from UK to NZ. And it's my personal journey, and it's how I migrated over 5 years ago from the United Kingdom to New Zealand. And it might be a bit brutally honest about New Zealand. And one of the comments I made on my emails back home when I first arrived was, well, if I were young and trendy, I'd be creating a video and uploading it to YouTube, like many of the videos I'd watched before I came here. So it's taken me 5.5 years to do this, so here we go. And there's a bit more experience, obviously, rather than just simple first impressions. And, oh yes, it may contain some British humour. So before we get into the glory of New Zealand, let's have a look at the glory of England. Now, I've picked these photos out from a photographer. He's a fellow Bradford lad, Dave Danovich, and he has this miraculous ability to make Bradford look good. He's also set up a few videos in here. So here's a little glimpse of Yorkshire while we wait for a few more people to join as well. So there was a brief glimpse of my old county, the county of Yorkshire. Going slightly further afield, let's move up to the Lake District in the northern part of England, and some memories from childhood. He's also taken some good photos of that. And there's back to Yorkshire, that's Whitby and Whitby Abbey. So the journey, I've come from the tiny island of the UK and come over to the tiny island of New Zealand. And in fact, I've come so far, I've fallen off the map. And I've used this photo and this background many times, and nobody's pointed out the fact that New Zealand isn't actually on this map. And that's why I use it. And it feels like a long, long way, because it is. So my first impressions, Kiwis love timber. Timber is everywhere. So timber framed houses, timber cladding, even timber piles. And in the UK, we've not used timber piles for about 100 years. The foundations seem to be significantly shallower than the ones we would use in the UK. A shallow foundation in the UK would probably go down to about 3 meters. Here, you're lucky if it scratches the surface. Terminology, so it's quite confusing if you've not come across some of the odd expressions. The expression dwang belies the Scottish ancestry of some of the settlers here. It's a Scottish term, otherwise known as a cladding rail or a side rail. Here we talk about expansive clay. Back in the UK, we talk about shrinkable clay. It's basically the same sort of thing. It's moisture sensitive. And there are all sorts of acronyms and terminology to get used to. One of the more common around here is Jaffa. So if you're from Auckland, you'll get known as a Jaffa by everybody else in New Zealand. And I think it stands for just another friendly Aucklander. Oh, yes. The other odd thing is we use jib plasterboard as a ductile structural material here, and they have calculations to prove it. Construction quality, yes, the distinct lack of construction quality in some of the issues we've seen. And these are not my words, these are words of a colleague who stood up at a conference and said, he's a building surveyor and he's never seen so many shit houses. And we'll explain why shortly. So the difference in design, lack of quality control, the complication with the national standards. Now, New Zealand does have its own standards, and some standards it shares with Australia. Many of these standards are isolated and they're rather old. Some are more than 30 years old or more. They tend to be more conservative, except for the timber one. I'm looking at timber and I'm thinking that's not as conservative as in the UK or the Eurocode for timber. There's also supplemental materials to these national standards, which turn out to be not optional, they're part of the standard. And then we have the building code. So the building code can overwrite some of the things written in the national standard. There's a distinct lack of textbooks, but thankfully there are a few websites you can refer to, and we'll pop and look at some of those later. There's also a distinct lack of software that's specific to New Zealand. Now, there's plenty of frame analysis software around, but I'm talking about design software to the New Zealand codes. And that's probably due to the size of the market for structural engineering in New Zealand is tiny. So why would any software company make it? Ground conditions. If you're a geotechnical engineer, this is the place to be. And normally geologists talk in terms of millions of years and rock formations from those eras, whereas we have rock formations that are only a few hundred years old. And of course, we have earthquakes being on the ring of fire, and that can have a big influence on your design. We also have volcanoes. As a result of some of those volcanoes, you get lava caves, certain geological interesting features. We also have landslips, which need to be considered. We have flooding, and we have high winds. So the environment is not particularly friendly for your buildings here. An explanation of why there are so many ship buildings in New Zealand is seen in this book. It's called Rottonomics, and it's a story of New Zealand's leaky building disaster. And it goes into quite a bit of depth as to how this arose. So we have the leaky building syndrome in New Zealand, and for a period of about 10 years, the weather tightness on some buildings wasn't great, combined with the fact that the preservatives and the preservative treatment of timber wasn't great either. Also have a look at this report, which is the CTV building in Christchurch, which collapsed during that earthquake. The building framework, building regulatory framework in New Zealand is quite similar to that in the UK. So we have a Building Act as well. In the UK, we have building regulations. Here we have a building code. And the building code refers to alternative solutions or acceptable solutions and verification methods, whereas in the UK, the building regulations refer to approved documents. And generally, the building regulations don't overwrite what's in the national standards, but here they do. So that's the regulatory framework in New Zealand. Where do you start? Well, a good place to start is the YouTube channel for these CPD webinars. And so there's now over 20 of these CPD webinars for structural engineers, as well as the playlists. So if you've reached this far in the YouTube video and you haven't subscribed yet, then I'd suggest you subscribe, you freeloading bastard. Let me know how you feel. Okay, Another tip you can do is create a master file. Now, in the old days, structural engineers would create a physical master file full of pieces of paper, so relevant safe load tables, snippets from codes of practice, and so on. Well, in the modern era, you can do something very similar by using electronic versions, PDFs, and of course, index it through Excel. And it's no secret I indexed it in the same first 9 chapters of the Eurocode, so 1 to 9, 0 to 9 as well. As part of your master file, you could keep a list of useful websites. As I said, there's a distinct lack of textbooks in New Zealand for engineering, but here are a few useful websites. It's worth making a note of them. And we go on. We'll come back to some of these later in the seminar. Here are a couple more I've added recently. So there's the natural hazards portal has just gone up from the government, which is recording all of the natural hazards and the incidents from natural hazards that have arisen over the past couple of decades in New Zealand. And that's not just earthquakes, it's also flooding as well, and storm damage. So that's also a useful resource. Yep, if you're thinking of doing engineering in New Zealand, it's quite a good idea to join Engineering New Zealand. And again, I'll pop back to that site later. Engineering New Zealand gives you a magazine that's really not really worth reading, to be honest. The Structural Engineering Society of New Zealand does give you a magazine that's actually worth reading because it's got technical information in it. So Engineering New Zealand has a number of special interest groups, and this is one of them. And this is the one you'd be particularly interested in. And it has more useful resources for structural engineers. As part of that, there is a thing called BOX. No, not those rugby playing people from South Africa. No, this is the body of knowledge and skills, and this is what you need to take you to CPEng level. So you can download that from the CSOP Society page, and it takes you through it. And to zoom in on that, it divides the competence standards for CPEng into 4 groups of elements. And that covers engineering knowledge, professional acumen, engineering management, and technical competence. And those will appear again later. Focusing in on the body of knowledge and skills, it lists it project phase by project phase. You can extract those and turn it into a reminder and a way of telling what you've learned throughout your career. And so from project B, brief and initial investigation. So can you perform technical literacy searches? Just tick yes if you can, or something that you need to attain, and on you go down the list of what you've achieved. So developed and detailed design and construction documentation. Can you prepare engineering quality specifications? Well, I hope so. So go in and tick it off. There's also another special interest group from Engineering New Zealand, and that's the Engineering General Practitioners. And this is aimed at the small practices. And one of the useful sides of this is the Slack channel, where you can exchange ideas, ask questions, and also they kind of arrange for coffee meetings. New Zealand standards are a separate body, and generally you have to pay for them, but the government has funded a number of free downloads. So if you go to the government website, it's MB, and you'll say, here are the top standards that you'll use in New Zealand in construction. So here's one for concrete, here's one for steel, and here's one for timber framed buildings. And you can download those for your use. And here they are again. So don't just download them, use them and explore the standards. And you can download a copy of MathCAD Express and try out those equations and see how far you get with it. So here's one for seismic loading, here's one for snow loading, here's one for wind loading. And there's also standards for assessment, seismic assessment of existing buildings, and that comes from NZSEE, the Society for Earthquake Engineering. They have a website with lots of resources worth looking at too. Also, refer you to Seminar 7. So in Seminar 7, we looked at technical guidelines for engineering assessments and looked at the seismic assessment of existing buildings as well. It's also worth looking at Seminar 8, which looks at the initial seismic procedure. So you should get the impression that earthquakes are pretty important and design for them is quite important in New Zealand. Also available through MB, this is one of the government departments, is a number of documents talking about geotechnical information, and module 6 is about the earthquake resistant retaining wall design. So again, you can download these documents, read through them, but don't just do that, try them out. So there are a number of worked examples to download, and so I've created MathCAD calculations based on those too. And it really allows you to get your head around the equations and the methodology of the retaining wall design. Here in the back of the building code, B1, there is a verification method number 4 for the design of shallow foundations. Further on, they're talking about piles as well. So again, pull it out and create your own calculations based on that, so you get your head around the methodology of foundation design to New Zealand standards. There's also a reinforced masonry manual that's available to download from Concrete NZ. From their website, you can download it, and it's a mere 429 pages, but it's chopped into all sorts of useful sections. And one of the sections gives you example calculations as well. So again, don't just download it, try it out. And here is one of the examples from there, example 3.2a. And you're looking at a reinforced masonry beam, and it explains how you design that to New Zealand standards. So coming on to Let's Get You Chartered. And again, this is a booklet you can download from the Engineering New Zealand website. They're 21 pages long, and it takes you through the process of getting chartered, what you need to get that CPEng status. Zoom in on that. It gives you an outline of the decision making and what you need to do. So note there, 4 to 6 years experience preparation. So generally you can't just pop out and come in as a chartered professional engineer, in spite of what I was told. So people who are already chartered, like me, I was a chartered engineer in the UK, they still want at least 2 years experience before you take your CPEng exam. So they look back on your previous 6 years of experience, but at least 2 of those have to be in New Zealand. There's now a new self-assessment tool available from the Engineering New Zealand website, which gives you a lot more detailed information on how you compile your records of work and how you assess yourself as to be ready for the chartership journey. That, and Engineering New Zealand covers all engineering, not just structural, but there is a separate guidance for structural engineers. So as part of Engineering New Zealand, you can get the Let's Get You Chartered for structural engineers. And again, you'll notice they divide it up into these 4 areas: the engineering knowledge, managing engineering work, professional acumen, and developing technical solutions. So as you go along, you need to compile your continuing professional development, or your CPD. This conveniently is available in your Engineering New Zealand login. So log into Engineering New Zealand website under your name, and you will find you can add your CPD records. And you can view and edit those as you see fit. And just type in the event you went to. Of course, these seminars are also useful to add to your CPD records. So the last one here, CPD Seminar 20, I've given it an hours of 1 hour. Parallel with that is your work record. So Engineering New Zealand website also allows you to record work records or work items. You will need these when you submit for your CPEng, but technically you only need 4 projects to submit. In the end, I picked 6, and it really depends on your experience. If you've got one big project that you've been doing for 6 years, hopefully you'll have got an all-round experience which will cover all the bases for that. So if we look at one particular record in the work, and it's a similar approach to your CPD records. You put in what you did, what your description was, what the duration was, and you can add the record or the PDF, for example, to that work record. This can turn out to be quite a useful tool because it may be many years before you actually apply for CPEng. So it's worth storing your work records as you go along. And this is the application. So let's go into the detail of that. So what are you assessing yourself for? What are you attempting to apply for? You want to apply for Chartered Professional Engineer. What's your practice field? In my case, it was structural engineering design and inspection and assessment of new and existing low-rise buildings as well. So you'll need at least 2 referees, and one of them has to be a Chartered Professional Engineer as well. You put in your credentials, so that's your degrees normally, and then you add your self-assessment, and so it's worth practicing this in a, shall we say, a Word file and compiling it. So again, they split it up into these questions. So your engineering knowledge question you need to answer, and then you need to tell them about how you managed engineering work, and then you need to tell them about how you developed your professional acumen, and then how you developed technical solutions. So we go through that. Then you provide them with your evidence records. In my case, I gave them 6, which we'll pop into, with a little paragraph about each of them, and you attach the records themselves. So in this case, it was a PS2 and the calculations that go with it, and in this case, the review log, and so on. So here are the evidence records that I went through. As I say, you probably need about 4, but I went for 5 to get them all broad and to cover the past six years as well. So it's going back to one of the previous employments in the UK. So just a couple of pictures, what it was, but then this is the meat of it in terms of engineering knowledge, managing engineering work, professional acumen, and so on. Now, the reason I have this is because my assessment was done online, because it's one of the far too many lockdowns that we had during COVID. And so I prepared a presentation to explain in bullet point form the application. So point 2 was about a screw pile at Hamilton Airport. This was a screw pile, and this is kind of the assets we got out of that. Westmount Apartments, this was about construction monitoring and dividing it up into the 4 areas, 4 elements that we're looking at CPEng. Tauranga Boys College for a detailed seismic assessment, and again the kind of things that we did there. Oxford Terrace, we're looking at HVM, which is hostile vehicle mitigation, and what sort of things we did that contribute to these 4 elements. At the end of all that, you're eventually awarded the title of Chartered Professional Engineer. How exciting. But wait, there's more. CPEng registration lasts up to 6 years, and I say up to, they can knock it down to 2 years. They might refer you for a 2-year assessment if you're kind of a young graduate, and reassessment is required at least every 6 years. But wait, there's more. You've got to go through that all again with Auckland Council, just so you can be a producer statement author. And we've talked about producer statements in previous seminars, so look back at those as PS1, PS2, PS3, and PS4. So as a structural engineer, you're probably looking at PS1s, PS2s, and possibly PS4s to sign those things off. And that has to be renewed every year. It's just filling in the form again and supplying the insurance, because the producer statement author goes with your company. Your CPEng is to you personally, but your producer statement author is relying on your company, and they want to see your insurance certificates, which only last a year. So hence you renew this every year. The practice areas differ from Auckland Council compared to Engineering New Zealand. And their idea of risk differs. So a high-risk building is not the same thing as a high-risk building to Engineering New Zealand.
But wait, there's more. Hang on to your seat, baby, because this one's a screamer.
It's all going to change soon. CPEng is going to be replaced with licensing, so you'll have licensed engineers or licensed professional engineers. And was a pressure from the government to make all engineers register under a government scheme and be registered engineers, and the equivalent of CPEng will be qualified and licensed through a government scheme, although this is a work in progress. So it may not happen, well, it won't happen this year, it may not happen in 5 years' time, but it will change eventually. Oh dear, I thought.
Fuck.
So I'll leave you with some images of the local parks around Auckland to show that indeed it is green in New Zealand, and there's a reason it's green as well. So these are a couple of the local parks in New Zealand. Not so far from Auckland.